Hello, this is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Terry Tyler, one of your hosts tonight.
And I'm Joe Barnhart. We want to welcome you. I want you to know if you do believe in God or if you don't believe in God, you should not be alone. Here in East Tennessee, you can find free-thinking atheists and agnostics and others, and this program is for people like that who want to have open discussion about religion and science and other matters without the supernatural beliefs. And today's topic is
consistency and faith.
Consistency and faith. But first, I want to tell you a little about the sponsors of our show. We just don't get a drop in from heaven to pay for it. And the Atheist Society of Knoxville frequently has a fun meeting at a place, an eatery. Tonight's meeting is at Barley's in the Old City, starting around 5:30. And look for the Silver Jacket, the God Delusion. But if you plan to preach or proselytize, kind of calm it down. And it's just come there for a good time and discussion.
Our second host is the Rationalists of East Tennessee. They have several regular monthly meetings. The first and third Sunday mornings of the month are usually lectures with lively roundtable discussions. The second Sunday, we hold the Skeptics Book Club discussion. On the fourth Sunday, we are now alternating with a get-together we call a Reflections meeting. It features a potluck lunch in someone's home. On alternate fourth Sundays, we will meet to play board games and similar activities.
Okay, so later in the program, we'll give you our website for additional information, times and locations. And we don't have a lot of news because we want to get into the program, but we've got an announcement to make. The Rationalists of East Tennessee will sponsor a public lecture, and that's November 15. That's on a Saturday. And the topic is, who are these doubters anyway? And the person coming in is Tom Flynn. He's executive director of the Council for Secular Humanism and a publisher of Free Inquiry magazine. They used to publish an article of mine now and then, and they published one of my books, come to think of it. And he's going to discuss the religious poles, what they mean and what's implied in when they say people are unbelievers or others. What does all that mean? That's what he's going to be doing. But we want to get in now into our topic. The topic has to do with consistency and faith. Now, most of us know from childhood what consistency is, and because we like to catch our parents when they're inconsistent and making us a promise. Faith is a word that has so many uses. A good meaning is simply trust. I've got faith in this chair. There's some chairs I don't have faith in.
Right.
So it's a rational faith, and it's tested, and so I trust it. There's some people, I think you're a good married man and lucked out and got a good wife. And
True.
And you have a lot of faith in her, and she has in you. And so in that sense, faith is a part of a community life. And you have children.
Right.
And they have faith in you. And so faith is something so the real issue is not whether people have faith and skepticism, because faith and skepticism, would you agree, go together. You can't have faith without being skeptical of some views.
Well, at least wanting to test the basis for it.
Yeah. In fact, in getting married, I hope if you're young or old for that matter and are thinking getting married, have some skepticism. Don't just take promises. So skepticism is a part of faith. And what we're trying to show, Terry Tyler, my guest and our guest, is helping us to show that people come out of a faith and a commitment, and they modify it, and we modify all along the way. It's as if we were on a ship, and the ship has to be remodeled and repaired. And our beliefs have to be remodeled and repaired. And after you live long enough, you look back, and you may have a new ship. But it depends on, I'm 83 now. My wife reminded me I'm not 82 anymore, just had a birthday. I'll have you know it was on All Saints Day, which I think I mentioned on this program. My wife reminded me that's only 6 hours after Halloween. That'll keep me humble. But on talking about faith and trust is just ordinary language. And then the real question is, what do you trust? And so every person who has faith also has lots of skepticism and doubt, because nobody can believe in everything. You have to believe in X. You often have to not believe in Y. Mm-hmm. So when I mention the word Martin Luther, what does that remind you of?
Well, it reminds me of the folks leaving England over persecution that was taking place at the time, because they questioned those beliefs, or they became skeptical of those beliefs. That is part of the reason we have this country here today from that perspective.
Yeah.
Is a fleeing from quote-unquote religious persecution, and the desire to find a different way with a different set of beliefs to potentially move forward. Or, you know, I can't help but think that people were sitting there similar to, as you said, we all do, that, you know, something gets said and it just doesn't quite sit right. And it doesn't sit right, and then that begins to fester just like a splinter does until something happens in order for the splinter to come out. Well, beliefs, I believe, are very similar.
I like that analogy,
that when something becomes incongruent or just doesn't feel right anymore, it kind of sits there and festers.
Well, that's what Martin Luther, and you were right, Luther had enormous impact on England. You know, even though Luther was there in Germany, he had impact on all of Europe and England, and eventually his revolution, I would say, the Reformation, but his impact had, eventually global impact.
Right.
And he had some questions about indulgences at that time, that you could sell indulgences, and if you buy some indulgences, you could get more forgiveness. And Luther started reading the book of Romans and the book of Galatians again in the New Testament. And he couldn't find anything about indulgences at all. And what he found would surprise him was what he calls later justification by faith or trust. And fundamentally what that meant is you get salvation, and that's what these people were interested in, because they believed they were damned. And that if you start with that premise, then it makes common sense to say, how do you get out of this mess? And Luther came up saying that you get there by trusting in the mercy of the deity, which, given the premise, makes a lot of good sense. Right. And works won't do it, which is, it seems to me the history of Protestantism is in many ways a reduction of the power of the priesthood and who controls salvation. And so in that sense, it's an economic revolution.
Right. I mean, I've never looked at it that way, but that's a very good point.
You don't have to buy salvation. You don't, you grew up in what church?
I grew up in the Church of Christ.
Church of Christ.
Right.
Now, could you have a Church of Christ without a minister, a paid minister?
You could, but you typically had the equivalent of the old circuit rider. You had a minister that had perhaps part-time in various locations, or some of the smaller rural churches of Christ that I attended periodically, they couldn't afford a full-time minister. So you basically had a person that had a day job Monday through Friday, but then preached on Wednesdays and on Sunday and Sunday night, which was the ritual. You went to church 3 times a week.
Now, whenever the Lord's Supper or the communion was distributed,
right,
in the Church of Christ, would you go to heaven if you didn't take communion?
Well, that's an interesting question, Joe, and you're asking me to go back to a few years, and there's a little bit of rust in the memory cells. But it was expected that you partook of communion, unless you didn't feel like you were worthy to partake of communion, because you might have done something that might require you to reconfess in front of the congregation at the altar call that always happened at the end of the sermon. For people to come forward and confess their sins in front of everyone, and therefore be reestablished on the path, or the debt was forgiven, or the sin or the transgression.
What strikes me is every community has to have something similar to this. If you violate the codes, you have to have a way of getting back into the good grace of the community. So in that sense, this is pretty natural, and it has no supernatural base at all. It's saying, if you have a community, you have to have rules and regulations and guidelines, and if you violate them, then you're out of the community, or if you won't back in, you've got to show that you really have changed enough to get back into the grace of the community.
And that's one of the points that I always question. I mean, it's words are cheap, but have you really reformed? Which always was one of those things that never really felt right. I mean, so many times it seemed like we put on our religious beliefs when we put on our suit and Sunday finery to go to church, and when we came home and we hung back in the closet again, we were almost different people during the week. And that was kind of one of the things that I never felt comfortable with.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And that was one of the things that caused me to question and push on things. Well, and the only other point I want to make before we move on is, there are those rules that perhaps are a little stronger than other rules, like a violation of the golden rule is one thing, of where I mistreat someone via unkind words or a prejudice or a bias, but to be told that it was immoral to dance and to sit in a Sunday morning service after a Friday night football game where all the teenagers were at the dance from the congregation. In fact, when you were getting the thou shalt not dance sermon from the pulpit, you were kind of looking, well, who wasn't at the dance Friday night?
I think our topic tonight is consistency.
Right.
And the inconsistency makes us to do two things, either change our behavior or modify the principle.
Right.
And in some cases, it's better to modify the principle, and in other cases, it's better to modify.
But again, you're back to community and you're back to laws.
Exactly.
I mean, the fact that there's a law, and if you break the law, then...
Why do you think there was a rule? And there was. I grew up in the Baptist tradition, and Baptists differed among themselves on this.
Well, I think some Church of Christs differed also.
But some of the Baptists did not believe in dancing. I wondered why. Can you tell me why they thought this was wrong?
Well, I think it's back into this notion of adultery and sexual thoughts and those sorts of things, and the fact that a man is dancing in close proximity to a woman.
You're not thinking of the multiplication table.
No, you're not, or the weather, or work, or anything else. And I think it was along the lines, I mean, probably well-intended, but, you know.
I enjoyed the dancing in the 60s.
Right.
Where
you were
for
apart.
One thing, you didn't have to be very good at it anyhow. But you were apart, and you could just go out and just have a good. It's like being a cheerleader almost.
True.
And there were rules against drinking, and you can see the rules. And so there are some of these rules that you can see make sense.
Mm-hmm.
If you get a community in which you have lots of the husband is heavy into drinking, you can understand why the wife, or conversely, would say, no liquor in the house. And so, rather than think these people are fools, try to understand, as an anthropologist would going into a community, how their rules are functioning for them, rather than looking on it from the outside and saying, well, they're not like us, they must be idiots. That's called ethnocentrism, and all of us practice that and get very condescending. In fact, it's so ingrained, I get condescending toward people who are condescending. That's how ingrained all that is, and I have to correct myself. Let me ask you this. Baptism in the Church of Christ means what? First of all, what is baptism?
Well, baptism is full immersion and the washing away of sins and the rebirth. Very, very similar to what's described when John the Baptist baptized Jesus, and I think that's the notion that you shed your earthly cocoon and put on your new spiritual cocoon, and that's what it's symbolic of. But it is a full dunking, as it used to be referred to, where you were totally put underwater.
Immersed,
as the word describes.
Okay.
Not sprinkled.
Not sprinkled.
Not sprinkled.
Now, is that, in other words, let me ask you, in the Church of Christ that you grew up in, was that necessary for salvation?
Absolutely.
If you weren't baptized, then what?
Then you had no chance of making it to heaven.
Okay.
You were most likely going to the hot spot.
Now, one of our callers, I think last time or time before last, I can't remember, from Alabama, challenged me on this. He said in his church, which he believed was Church of Christ, that he had never heard of that. And which led me to think either the churches of Christ are changing, some of them, or he confused it with the United Church of Christ, which is another group altogether differently.
Right.
It's more of a liberal church.
Well, back to your point of consistency, and on this point in particular, I found that there wasn't consistency from Church of Christ congregation to Church of Christ congregation. I mean, let's take the notion of music in the church.
Music in the church,
The more traditional Church of Christ belief was if you had music in the church other than the human voice, that you weren't singing and making melody in your heart. You were tempted to listen to the accompaniment of the piano or the organ or the orchestra or whatever, and you really weren't singing and using that talent. There were other churches of Christ where there was a piano there to assist the congregation with finding the right pitch and the right rhythms as one moved forward. But each congregation has its own set of deacons and its own set of elders. There is no superstructure like the Roman Catholic Church or some of the other denominations. And it was basically a locally run congregation, and the rules and the regulations were established from a governance perspective by the elders and the deacons of the church.
So it was locally run.
Locally run. And so there's not surprising that there could be a variant in beliefs. And
that approach is affecting all denominations now. As a matter of fact, the Pope and one I think one of the cardinals, certainly one of the bishops, I think the Pope did something and demoted him because he was trying to deny politicians communion if they were pro-choice on the abortion issue. And the Pope stepped in and demoted him. Now, what the Pope is, I think, learning is that a corporation can't work wholly from the top down. And that this is a big company that's got lots of buildings and a lot of people to support, and if you don't pay attention to your customers, you're not going to be in business. And in Europe, they're in big trouble.
Right.
And I think looking at it from a purely economic financing point of view, I think the Pope is beginning to realize if you're not paying attention to these people, the collection plate is going down. I don't think it's his sole motive. I think he also is interested in how you relate to people consistently,
right,
and taking this, what's called the gospel to the poor. The word gospel is supposed to mean good news.
Right.
So it's interesting for me as a student of organizations, and you're a better student than I am, just seeing how these shift around in order to keep the company going.
Absolutely.
And the service going. Now, in the churches of Christ, you didn't use the word sacraments, did you?
No. No. It was communion.
Communion,
right.
Yeah. And in the Baptist tradition, you didn't hear the word sacraments. The word sacrament was borrowed from the Catholic tradition, in that communion, and you had at least 7 sacraments, but mostly communion and baptism, and they were supposed to be means of grace.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they were unfortunately in the hands of the clergy, and so if you didn't get a sacrament, you can lose out quite a bit of grace. And I think that's why gradually some of these sacraments were taken out of the power of the clergy. Now, there is in Catholicism what's called the senior deacons. Mm-hmm. And they can function like a Protestant minister as long as a bishop or a priest can bless all the sacraments. Then they can be distributed. It's almost as if you can get a priest or a bishop to bless the sacraments in a month's supply in advance, put them on cold storage, and then take them out. But so in that sense, the clergy, in that sense, and you can see the function of clergy changing in the denominations. And in some denominations, they insist that every member of the church is a minister, and they divide up the labors.
Right.
And then that's volunteer work, like a lot of organizations have to do.
I apologize. My East Tennessee allergies are getting to me.
We all got it, and we pay for this beauty in East Tennessee.
Yes, we do. Twice a year for sure.
And would you say that this now in the Church of Christ, you can fall from grace? Talk about that a little bit, would you?
Well, you originally obtain your grace at the age of accountability, which is a huge variable as to when that comes into play.
Yeah.
You have your grace up until that point of your coming of age from an accountability perspective, and then you're baptized, and so you are in grace at that point in time. But if you do something that is counter to one of those beliefs, you have sinned and you have fallen from grace. But as we talked earlier, there is the ability to go and profess your sins in front of the entire community and be restored again.
Now, do you have to confess every sin?
You're supposed to confess every sin.
That's a lot of confession.
That's an awful lot of confession.
Did you have a lot in the Church of Christ?
We did. It was rare that you had an altar call that there wasn't someone wanting to be baptized or someone asking for forgiveness.
Oh, now let's suppose you fall from grace.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have to get rebaptized?
No.
No, okay.
No. Baptism was a one-time event.
So after that, then you can get forgiveness as many times.
Many times.
But you don't need to be baptized, but just
Right.
one time. But those who haven't been immersed
Never received grace.
So Methodists, if they are sprinkled, where are they going when they die?
Well, according to the Church of Christ, they are not going to heaven.
And well, they're not going to Newport.
They're going to to hell.
They're going to hell.
Right.
Okay. Now,
and it is so strong that it is it's extremely frowned upon if it is known that you were only sprinkled and not baptized, and you partake of communion. That is considered a no also.
Yeah. Okay, I got you. How many Churches of Christ members are there in the world right now, would you think?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't seen those statistics.
Well, the largest denomination is Southern Baptist.
Right.
And
I would think Church of Christ is on a decline.
Yeah, I would think so.
They just...
If there were 5 million, I would think there are not that many more than that. I'd be surprised.
I mean, we could probably Google it right quick and find out, but I don't know. But I would predict, just given what we are seeing with millennials and what millennials are after from an experience perspective, that the traditional Church of Christ that I was brought up in doesn't satisfy those needs today.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And I would think that unless things significantly change with a lot of those fundamental beliefs, then you're basically catering to and providing a service to a set of beliefs that fits a dying group
yeah.
from a population perspective.
That's interesting. You can compare them to, say, Unitarians, which is another small group.
Right.
But in many ways, the difference is the Unitarian beliefs seem to be on the rise, even though the Unitarian churches are small in number.
Right.
And so, but you see what's called universalism and Unitarianism in the major denominations being pretty prevalent now, the beliefs. The Churches of Christ's notion of baptism as essential for salvation is pretty much fading out. And among Catholicism, that's interesting to watch, as to how much weight is given to the sacraments for salvation. This whole notion of salvation, you see, is... And then you have the notion of justification by faith or trust in the deity. Now that's Luther. When you think of that, then the sacraments aren't necessary, because it's not by works that you are saved in the first place on this. So what I'm suggesting is, in all of these religions, there has to be, and is in fact, an element of trying to put these beliefs together consistently. And then when they can't do it, some of the beliefs are modified or are changed significantly.
Or a group leaves the church and forms their own.
Forms their own, yeah. Yeah. And now you see this a lot. From the 19th century on, you can study how big, and the reason I say from the 19th century on, that's when you have the American population growing significantly,
right,
and you have the freedom to do it. Now, if you're in a society in which you don't have the freedom to do it,
that's a horse of a different color.
It won't happen.
Right.
You had to go to war to do. Okay, we got to have a break here as soon as they tell us. So we don't want to run over time, but I want to press on into another point. I've got a book here called "God Told Me to Tell You." We got a call in. Let's see what we have here. Okay. We have a call in. Let's hear from you, please.
Well,
Go.
hello, it's Faithless Forest. I've been watching the program, and I have developed a question.
Okay, let's hear it.
You were talking about the different practices with respect to baptism and, full immersion versus sprinkling. And I know I've heard from other programs there's issues of childhood baptism or infant baptism versus adult baptism. And, of course, I have no idea which denominations do what. But it occurs to me that I do know my father was baptized as a child because I've seen a photograph of my father in a dress. When I saw it in my grandmother's photo album, I assumed it was a little girl, and I asked what it was all about, and she says that's your father in his baptismal dress. Now, I assume, this is northern Minnesota, I assume that they were practicing some kind of Lutheran church thing, but it occurs to me that I don't know enough to know maybe specifics, and maybe you guys can tell me what denomination my father would have been baptized in.
I'll take the first shot at that. Our children were both baptized as infants, and they had on very similar baptismal type gowns. But the baptism was merely the minister reaching into the baptismal font and touching their head with water as symbolic, and it was the whole service to me was more around the commitment of my wife and I as parents and the church to create an environment that would allow this young person to grow up and discover things, as opposed to both our children, when they reached their decision point of 12 or 13 years old, decided that it was time for them to take the next step, and they were both baptized from an immersion perspective in a Methodist church. Not a Church of Christ, but that started their faith journey. So I think that is a practice that we see in Lutheran, I believe Presbyterian. I'm not sure about the Episcopal. The Methodists for sure do practice this infant baptism, but it's more symbolic, and there's even a long thing that the parents have to recite and agree to, and the congregation even has to recite and agree to be this supporting womb or ecosystem for the nurturing of this soul to reach their point of accountability. Does that help?
All right. It gives me perspective about the variety of beliefs, certainly. I guess I was wondering if there might be a name for what my father went through, and maybe I've already learned that it would just be a Lutheran tradition. Yeah,
the Lutheran tradition does the sprinkling in infancy. A lot of the Protestant churches do that too. So this gets right to the heart, though, of the subject on the screen about consistency, because I think I heard you say earlier that, young people have, I forgot. Age of accountability.
Yeah. So why do they even need to have, then, this infant procedure involving the little dress if they're already kind of, if it's an automatic thing?
Good, sensible question. Where does the sprinkling come from?
Well, I can't help but think, the reason all this happens is that we want to celebrate, young life, and that's why institutions are created to make an opportunity for a celebration.
Now, you keep in mind that the Christian tradition grew partly out of the Hebrew tradition, where they had circumcision of the child on the 8th day. Now, Paul indicates somewhat, not clearly, that baptism is a kind of replacement. See, Paul is saying the circumcision has no real meaning anymore, so he wants to do away with it. So I think what happened is that the circumcision, which obviously is in early childhood, faded out, and then sprinkling eventually came about partly as a dedication ceremony of the community to nurture and raise the child properly, rather than become a means of salvation.
Right.
In fact, it's almost a way of saying that salvation itself gets redefined, and it's no longer just fire insurance, if it was ever that in the first place. And I don't think the Apostle Paul thought of it as simply as fire insurance. Right. It's a whole new way of life.
All righty. Well, you've helped a little bit. In a way, I was sort of hoping to learn that there was a particular name for a particular denomination or further subdivision of Lutheranism.
Okay.
But if there isn't, then I've at least learned that. Well, let me clear the line. You're probably at your mid-program break time anyway, and I hope you get some more callers.
As a matter of fact, thank you.
Thank you very much.
As a matter of fact, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox, they baptize infants by immersion.
Oh.
But the Lutherans and the Presbyterians and the Methodists and Episcopalians do it mostly by sprinkling and not by immersion. I think the Eastern Church is the only one that does it by immersion because they know Greek, and baptism means to immerse. Okay, well, we're close to the program break, so let's do that while we're at it.
In case you're just tuning in, this is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. Freethought Forum is funded jointly by them and by individual contribution. Shows are live most every Tuesday from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern on Knoxville Community Access Television Channel 12 or Channel 194, depending upon your cable network. Tell your out-of-town friends to see us streaming online at ctvknox.org. That's ctvknox.org.
Okay, it's a call-in show, and we like to think we're a live show. And the viewers can call in, and the number should be on the screen for you, and we'd be glad to hear from you, and we can do some dialogue. So let's get back now to the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee are sponsoring us. And so we want to continue with our program. And I have here a book called God Told Me to Tell You. And it's written by a member of a denomination called the Assembly of God. What's interesting to me is that he is showing the inconsistencies in his tradition. It takes a lot of courage to do this.
Oh, it does.
And the man is honestly trying to say that there's a lot of fraud in this, especially this faith healing business. And here's a man who has the courage to say, to his own people, we've got to clean this up. And he wrote a book, and it talks about Oral Roberts and all of these guys, and it's written as if some rationalists of East Tennessee or Atheist Society of Knoxville co-authored it, but no, he wrote it himself. And you've got to say this guy has a good sense of let's be at least consistent within our view. And I would, it's a shocker to read the book. He talks about the placebo effect.
Right.
And it's an incredibly good book. I'd want to mention, since I brought this up, the notion of speaking in tongues. Most denominations today don't have the speaking in tongues. Yours didn't.
No.
But the Assemblies of God,
and some Baptists.
Yeah, there are a few Baptists who still do that, but not very many.
Not very many, but there's still a few.
Some of them speak it. It's in a foreign tongue, but it's not. But there's a passage in 1 Corinthians in which Paul apparently has there in Corinth people who are doing this. It's a kind of a charismatic thing, and the church is just overloaded with it. And Paul comes in and realizes it's a lot of disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting to see how this, it's almost as he's a company manager coming in saying, we've got so much disorder, and he says to them, I speak in tongues more than all of you. I mean, Paul never takes second place to anybody, and he's always wrestling with his humility.
Right.
But we can all identify with his problem.
Yeah.
But anyhow, here he is saying, if you're going to have speaking in tongues, do it one at a time. Now that puts a real damper. If you've ever been around these groups, it's wild. And he says, do it one at a time. And when you have a speaker in tongues, have an interpreter.
Mm-hmm.
And he says it's like an instrument. If you've got an instrument, you don't want just to have music. I mean, just sound, you want to have music. And so it's got to be, the English translation, it's got to be meaning.
Right.
And he's saying these, speaking in tongues, you should have an interpreter. In fact, I was at one of these Assembly of God meetings, and I said to one of the ministers, let me take one of your persons speaking in tongues and an interpreter, and let me write down what the interpreter says, and then let me get another interpreter and let me write down and see if they come up with the same interpretation. And he said, no, we can't do that.
And I think we might know why.
I think we might know why. But I was wanting to see if they've got divine interpreters. I want to know if he gets the same message. I thought that would be a nice, simple test.
Excellent test. Excellent test.
But unfortunately, they would not permit that. I think I was at a meeting where Oral Roberts' son was getting more revelations than I could sneeze at it. I just thought, man, here's a guy just full of divine revelations. I don't know how he keeps up with all of them. But anyhow, Paul then says it's got to be decently, and that's his word in the translation, decently and in order.
Mm-hmm.
And what he's saying is each one has to listen to the other so that it says it will be profitable. And he furthermore says, he not only says you have to have an interpreter, but he says the interpreters should give a message of edification, uplifting. And what's interesting to me, here these people have all this divine input, but Paul is saying if it doesn't meet a rational process, and if the outcome isn't uplifting and meaningful, then it's not genuine. And what I'm suggesting then is reason
mm-hmm.
and faith,
mm-hmm.
even in this rather wild situation. You have to have an element of reason and skepticism to make it work. Otherwise, and Paul is saying it's chaos, and he's trying to overcome
right.
the chaos situation. And he even says that people looking from the outside will think you're mad. That's how wild it was. And of course he says that, he's a PR. I mean, he's concerned about the PR of the church.
Right.
But in the Church of Christ, you didn't have to worry about that.
No, we didn't have to worry about that.
Now, what if a deacon did misbehave? How did the pastor deal with him? I mean, did you have church squabbles going on in the Church of Christ? How did they deal with it?
Well, in any community, you have squabbles. So
yeah.
that's just a normal thing. But, the minister was not really the person that dealt with that. It
mm-hmm.
was the superstructure. So if it was a deacon involved, then it was the deacons dealt with it first, and then they reported to the elders, who were the superstructure, the board of directors of the company, if one wants to put it that way. And that's the way the church would function. But, was there, I think another part that you're kind of hinting at in your question is, was there such a thing of deacons being de-deaconized or de-elderized. And I think if the transgression was bad enough, that yes, that probably took place. But that's no different than
exactly
these CEOs that we've been reading about in the paper these days that have done things that kind of broached that ethical line that their board of directors had laid out from unethical conduct and a tone at the top. They no longer are CEOs of those corporations. So I think it's the same sort of a structure.
I like the word structure, that you have to have a community, you have to have structure.
You do.
And we're basically getting at the root of what we're going to have on a program sometime in the future, to show that the so-called Ten Commandments, most of them are simply not divine revelations.
They're pretty commonsensical.
They're commonsensical.
Right.
And the word commonsensical is common consensus, and then putting all our senses together in common,
Right.
and trying to, it's an interrelationship.
Right.
You simply cannot have a community without controlling lying and stealing. And you can't have a community without controlling adultery, because you've got all the kids and you don't know who they belong to or to whom they belong to and who is in charge of raising them.
Right.
And there has to be control of this. And envy or covetousness, you can ruin a community by having envy, because you want to pull somebody down in order to replace him yourself, and that's very destructive to a community. So what I'm suggesting is that this so-called divine revelation is really a consensus of people who want to live together. They don't have a choice. They have to have these rules
Right.
and regulations. So you grew up in a church, and I grew up in a church or churches, and we can see these things operating.
Right.
And some of the operations seem to make sense, and some of the operations make less sense.
Exactly.
And all companies and corporations discover the same phenomenon.
Countries with their laws and rules and regulations, and states and cities and other things from an ordinance perspective, absolutely.
Exactly. It have to be modified. And the family relationship's the same way.
Same thing.
And so it's you want stability and structure so that you can have predictability. But the structure can be smothering if it prevents good interaction.
Which is an interesting point that I'd like to ask you a question about. I mean, so many times we have these rules that are just, they're the rules because they're the rules. And I think, you know, I look back upon my childhood growing up, and I look back upon our kids' childhood growing up. And there seemed to be a lot better results if there was a dialogue about the consequences of doing things, as opposed to ask a question and the answer is no. Then you're sitting there saying, well, I don't understand the context, I don't understand the basis, I don't understand the rationale for the rule, so you've left me no choice but to test it. And this is something that you know, why is it we tend with our rules and our regulations, regardless of the organization, be it political or religious or business or whatever, why is it that people test rules when you don't have the dialogue about consequences?
Good. We got to, don't lose that. We got a caller, but we don't want to lose this. Go ahead to our caller. Let's hear what you have to say, please.
Yes, I was just been hearing you talk this time. It's pretty good. And I was just wondering if it you guys in your mind, do you just not believe in a God anymore, or have you been turned off and realized how wrong and organized religion is, because that is the boat that I'm in now after being schooled in that subject and historical sciences over the Bible. I have realized that the church world is just not right, you know. And I was just wondering how you guys, you know, what's your stand on that?
Okay, since that's a tough question, why don't you deal with it a little bit? That's a good question. It deserves a good answer. So.
It does.
It's an excellent question. Believe in God. I believe that there is a higher power out there, that this just didn't happen by happenstance. There's something out there, be it energy or something else. There is something out there. I don't think you can walk out in nature. I don't think you can look at a bloom in the spring of the year. I don't think that you can enjoy a beautiful sunset like we had here in East Tennessee last night. I don't think that you can look at the individuality of snowflakes without going, wow. Or looking up in the night skies.
All good scientists know what awe is.
So there's this awe, and call it whatever you want to call it. There is a fundamental belief there, but where I get tripped up, and very similar to what I hear you asking about, is the inconsistency in these religions. And you know, my background, the biggest inconsistency was judge not that you be not judged, yet every other rule we had was a judgment. And that's inconsistent. And
it is.
Being a scientist myself, a nuclear engineer to begin with, it was, how do you deal with the inconsistency? I mean, go ye therefore into all the world and preach the gospel to every nation, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit, was the great commission of the Church of Christ. Well, but wait a minute. Let's go back and look at the fundamental belief system of the indigenous folks that occupied North America to begin with, and they were a heck of a lot more religious than we were.
Exactly.
With regard to respect of earth, the ecosystem, being thankful, primarily being peaceful. It was only when our humanistic traits got in the way that you had warring factions back then.
Warring factions, yes.
So, you know, turned off on religion, forms of religion that are judgmental, yes, very turned off too. But belief in a greater power, belief in the need for community, belief in the need to come together in some place that allows a healthy dialogue that both the rationalists of East Tennessee and certain religions that are out there today allow to occur, where you look at the similarities of beliefs and where you find differences, you seek to understand why are there differences and what are the bases in those differences.
Exactly.
And wow, you made me think about something different. I mean, this is a part of that lifelong learning that we all need to be a part of. And I'll close with one quote. My sister-in-law that died from cancer was an educator, and her famous quote was, "When you're through learning, your life is over." And I think there's a lot to be said to that.
A lot to say for that.
A lot to be said for that.
That is very true. They're set in their ways and they don't grow. And, you know, there's so much out there to learn. In my historical science studies, I just took a course that took 2 years on pre-Adamic civilizations.
Right.
And when I've mentioned it to churchgoers and stuff, you know, their opinion is we all came from Adam and Eve, and boom, that's it.
Right.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Most of us modify our views piecemeal, a bit at a time. And that makes sense, because you never want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so then you look back after 20 years and you realize you've made some major changes. And you realize, wow,
Yeah.
Major changes. And I'm much more leaning toward naturalism, much more than supernaturalism. In fact, there is a view of theism that is wholly, except in its overall view, is wholly naturalistic. You don't have divine revelation. It's called process theology. And you do not have people hitting God for special revelations, because they say nature is revelation. If you want to understand what God's doing, look at nature. That's God's body. God's embodied. And that's awfully close to naturalism, it seems to me. In fact, on specifics, like the abortion issue, things like that, I don't see any difference, because they approach it empirically and rationally, whatever the specific issue is. And you don't have any one guy saying, I've got all these special revelations, and the other guy, like Joseph Smith, he's got these golden plates that he hid, so now, and that makes you suspicious. But so your question makes a lot of good sense. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. So promise you'll come back to us on another day.
All right.
And have some more good questions, and we hope we'll give you more time for talking to us.
That's what I'm all about. I mean, we're all on a continuous learning basis.
Where are you from, by the way?
I'm from local here in Knoxville.
Oh, good.
So,
hope you'll stay with us.
And come out and visit some of the sponsors and some of their events. I think you would find that interesting.
Yeah, I just may do that, because I'm not turned off by anybody that's a free thinker.
Oh, so, yeah. Even when you differ on one thing, on things you can learn about, you learn a lot from people you disagree with.
Absolutely.
And
well, I like facts and historical facts and something that you can see, you know.
Well, you can see that's what we're trying to do on this, trying to see how historically how religions have developed and grown and modified. And,
not very good.
Well,
but I'll let you go, gentlemen. You can have your final word.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Well, that was a very good question. We didn't have time to deal with it the way it should be dealt with. But I'm impressed with the biblical scholars nowadays who really are good historians. Some of the trustees of the seminaries and the universities or colleges get nervous about them. But that's because the trustees aren't scholars themselves, and they need to stay out of the... In other words, if you hire somebody to do the business, then let him do the business. A good contractor, if he hires a carpenter, lets the carpenter do the job.
Absolutely.
The same if you hire historians and researchers in history, let them do the work, rather than tell them if they don't come up with the right conclusions, they get fired. That's not scholarship. That's propaganda. And a university is not a propaganda machine. Well, thank you for being with us, and I hope you'll be with us. How many more seconds we got? Are we finished?
40.
We are closing here.
This has been Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalist of East Tennessee. I'm Terry Tyler, and enjoyed being with you tonight.
And I'm Joe Barnhart, and this is a feedback program, so you'll stay with us on this. And you can
see this show on Tuesdays from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time on this Knoxville station, or streaming live at ctvknox.org.
Okay, I want to thank Jonas and